everybody. Welcome to the first virtual Food Literacy for All 2024. Hope everyone is getting settled into the Zoom. I'm Shakira Tyler, and I'm the co-instructor for this course. And you see my baby's hand as I'm nursing him, so don't be alarmed. Today we have a super big treat for you all. Christy Spackman, who's going to give a presentation on the taste of water. And really quickly, the 2024 theme for this year for Food Literacy for All is Planted in History, a Food Future Informed by the Past. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, of course, we have to thank our generous sponsors that have continuously supported the Food Literacy for All team through the years. The School for Environment and Sustainability SEAS and the Center for the Education of Women and other campus programs. Next slide, please. And this is a huge production that we cannot pull off alone. More team members include Megan Gross, who's the graduate student instructor of the GSI, along with Mayexi Hernandez, who's another GSI, Kimmy Van Wedge, who's the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative coordinator, and Sammy Maldonado, who's the course coordinator, Food Literacy for All, and Chris Taylor, our LSA tech expert. Next slide, please. So there are various ways to engage. We have various social media platforms. They're all listed here. And then we have the poll questions on how you can get credit for the questions that the speakers ask. And then, of course, all classes will be filmed and available on the student or the SFSI website. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the assistant, he is very precious. Sorry.
It'd be wonderful to see him.
Yeah, I'm going to hand it over to my co-instructor, Margot. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to show this slide, and the U of M biological station just thought that people in this class might be particularly interested to know about some of these classes that are available during the spring and summer. It's a chance to do field-based courses in northern Michigan. So here's some of the courses that they're offering in 2024. You get to go up north and spend 4 weeks learning things like mammalogy and ethnobotany in the field in northern Michigan. So if you're interested, check it out. I think the application deadline is March 15th. So you have a little bit of time to think about it and decide. And oh, I'm going too fast. Here we go. I have the pleasure of introducing Christy Spackman, who holds a joint appointment in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and the Arts, and Future of Innovation in Society and the Arts, Media, and Engineering Department at Arizona State University. Before that, from 2015 to 2018, she was the Hickson-Riggs Early Career Fellow in Science, Technology, and Society at Harvey Mudd, and she completed her doctorate in food studies at New York University. I met Christy when we were both still in graduate school. I think it was around 2001. We went to this one-day food mini conference before the National Communication Association in San Francisco, and I've been a big fan of her work ever since. Her work focuses on how the sensory experiences of making, consuming, and disposing of food influence and are influenced by technologies of taste, her term for the oft overlooked technologies and practices used to manage sensory aspects of foods during production. I've long appreciated her call to pay attention to sensory labor. She runs also, or did for a while, a sensory laboratory, focusing on the labor part of that word, right? This is the daily work that's done by our mouths, noses, hands, ears, and eyes, and how the seemingly natural experiences of smelling and tasting are in fact carefully and intentionally designed and shaped by technological innovation, market pressures, and regulatory structures. Those of you in the class have now read the intro to her brand new, really exciting, and also quite beautiful book, The Taste of Water. I don't know if Zoom will edit it out if I try to show it to you, but oh, here it is. You could use without blocking me for a moment. And she's kindly agreed to share a little bit about that with us tonight. But here's what the flip video you collectively voted as your favorite of the ones selected by the GSIs this week had to say about it. This is from Isabella.
In the introduction to Christy Spackman's The Taste of Water, she emphasizes the ways in which municipalities have sought to erase identifiable taste and odor from drinking water. She introduces the term terroir, which links the taste, place, and production of a food product. In reference to the efforts made to erase the taste of water, Spackman uses the term industrial terroir, which separates taste from place. This discussion made me realize that I don't even know for sure where the water I'm drinking comes from. I thought it was the Huron River, but until I Googled it, I wasn't certain. And even after confirming, this reading made me face the astounding reality that the same water we kayak through and where we feed the ducks at the Arb is the water that comes out of our taps. That water is processed and meticulously modified not only to make it safe, but to make it aesthetically pleasing, which is to say completely void of any notion that it comes from the Huron River. I encourage you all to look into where the water in your hometown comes from and consider whether or not you would have known that based on the look or taste. I bet you wouldn't, and this reading made me realize that that is very intentional.
That was excellent. If you have not signed up for the week that you will submit your flip video, please do that. Check out Canvas. The link is in the syllabus to the sign up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy. And I think I've made it so you can forward the slides yourself, but let me know if I have not successfully done that.
First of all, thank you all so much for inviting me to talk with you about my work and my book. This is actually the first time that I've had an opportunity to talk with an audience since my book transitioned from being a bunch of ideas that I've been thinking with for almost the last decade into a reality, like a material object that I can drop on the floor and potentially squish toes or bugs or dust bunnies more often in my house, to be honest. Isabella, I want to thank you for that very amazing overview of my book. You make me question if I should have decided to focus on industrial terroir, but I did. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Thank you to Margot and Shakara and everyone at University of Michigan for this invitation. It's just such a pleasure to be with you. We're having a delightfully rainy day in Phoenix, Arizona. So as the sun goes down, I'm sure I will get a lot more mood lighting going on. But in the interim, let's just have a good time together. As your Professor Margot said, my name is Christy Spackman. I am jointly appointed between two very different schools at Arizona State University. A couple decades ago, our university decided to mess with disciplinary names. So my one school that I'm in, the School for the Future of Innovation and Society, you could think of as a school that is concerned with science and technology policy. We disciplinarily draw from a lot of different people. We consider ourselves a school of misfits. And my other school, the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering, is housed in the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts. It's definitely an arts program, but it is also a school of misfits, which I think is very exciting because all of us are in our own ways misfits. My background is actually in chemistry and biochemistry. And then I was working as a lab tech at the University of Chicago and was very good at my job, but didn't like my job. And so at night, I ended up going to school for some culinary training. And that's where I learned about the fact that there's this whole world of food scientists and research chefs and folks who are actually doing all this really cool work to make the food taste the way it does that we encounter either in a restaurant or on our kitchen table or in our grocery store. And with that in mind, I ended up starting a doctoral program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in food science. And then I left that to do the work in food studies at NYU, specifically because the questions I wanted to ask were questions about why people eat the foods they do with the people they eat them with. So next slide, please. That one, yeah. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. There is a poet, George Ella Lyon. She was Kentucky's poet laureate from 2015 to 2016. And a few years ago, she started collaborating with writer Julie Landsman in a project they called the I Am From Project. And maybe you've encountered this in some of your own classes, but it's something that I've started using in my class, thanks to some work by Jessica Barnes. And what George Ella Lyon suggests and Julie Landsman suggests is rather than just saying, hey, this is who I am, you actually go through and write out all of these I am things to make a poem. And so I'm boldly going to read you my current I am poem. Please bear with me. I am from the lands the Shoshone historically called home, great or many greats, or simply grandchild of settlers who carved homes into dirt so they could grow and harvest potatoes in an area that once belonged to others. I am from home-baked bread and hand-me-down clothes, gardens with endless rows of green beans snipped on the front porch in late summer sun. I am from a pile of wood so big you could spend hours wandering around, peering at cat skeletons or birds, until my uncles decided it best be a bonfire to mark the passing generation. I am from shoes slapping the concrete, running for the bus or school or a meeting, or just to feel the wind on your skin. Time optimists, my family is. I am from love, fingers drumming or singing, forget cake, eat pie, oldest sister of 3. This is me. Next slide, please. So the core question that's going to drive our conversation today is, what work does tasting water do? And as Margot pointed out, I have this new book, The Taste of Water, that is all about, in a way, the work that tasting water does. And since you're in Michigan, you're very aware of the crisis that has been ongoing in Flint, Michigan for the last few years with regards to water contamination. And I loved what Isabella said about all this work that happens to make our water both safe and palatable and potentially not reflective of the place it comes from. And there's a lot of fantastic scholarship about what happened in Flint. But what really has stuck out to me is the fact that there were these perceptual cues that actually had nothing to do with the specific dangers in the water at the time, but were, let's call them, side products of the dangers in the water that were being ignored. So when folks, as you know the story, when folks went to their city council saying, hey, my water has stuff in it, it looks wrong, et cetera, and they were told it was safe, there's this big disjuncture between the questions of perceptual experience, what you see and smell and taste with your body, and what the chemists were supposedly saying was safe. And this disjuncture between what we know and how we know has really stuck with me over the decade plus that I've been studying and thinking about sensory perception, in part because there are these moments when something that can taste perfectly good might actually not be safe for us, or something that can taste really bad might be completely safe for us, or in the case of Flint, actually the fact that it's not good, that it doesn't look good or smell good or whatever, is also actually an indicator that it isn't safe. And we have this fascinating conundrum that's emerged over the 20th century, where the systems we used to use, and by we, I mean our ancestors, the folks who came generations before us, for identifying whether a water was safe, have been replaced by entirely new systems. So to get us started, I sent out, or your instructors agreed with me to send out a tasting guide. So you should have prepared, ideally at this time, a couple different glasses of water, at least 1, maybe 2 or 3. If you don't, quick, get up, go grab a glass of water from your tap. If nothing else, we can still taste together. And I'm just going to take a moment so you can make certain everything's arranged. And as a reminder, please keep water and computer separate. We are not baptizing our electronics today. So I'm assuming you have a couple different cups of water in front of you. Ideally, they're covered. If they're not, that's okay too. Ideally, they've been anonymized by yourself or someone else. If not, that's okay. We're not in a sensory laboratory. We don't need to actually make certain that the knowledge we produce is ready and capable to circulate elsewhere. But we are going to use our bodies right now as instruments to think about things perhaps differently. Next slide, please. So I think we're all experts, and this is a term that I call everyday expertise. You have tasted the water that you drink, be it from your tap or from bottles, every day for multiple days for potentially multiple years. You have a really good feel already for when it's not right. You probably don't notice when it's right most of the time. You've taken showers in it. You flushed toilets, you've watered stuff with it. Like, this is water you know really well. You probably know it in some ways as well, if not better, than the folks working in the water treatment plants in your city. And they would tell you, it's especially those who work in wastewater treatment, that all this time they've spent around the chemicals and stuff that they use to treat your water have, for some of them, just blown their sensory systems out. They're like, can't smell anymore. Smelled a lot of chlorine in my day. So hats off to them for all that work they do. And okay, so we've covered our expertise, and I wanted us to just remember that we are experts because, as I'll get to in a minute, tasting water is really hard. So how do we taste? Normally, I assume when you grab a cup of water, you just drink it, although you might also inadvertently smell it because that's what we do. But we're going to slow down here, and we're going to steal a page from the wine industry to taste in a way that is more like how a sommelier might taste. If you're not aware of the new and emerging world of water sommeliers, feel free to look it up after this conversation. It's quite interesting and I actually think really exciting. Even though I'm opposed in general to a world with bottled water, I'm deeply enchanted with a world where our waters taste different and we engage with those differences in meaningful and interesting ways. So, although I'm not a wine drinker, I have been trained to drink wine. And one of the things that we do in these sorts of tasting things, when you're tasting like a professional instead of just like a person hanging out with each other, is you slow down. You're going to look at your water, you might sniff it, then you're going to sip it, and then you're going to pause even further and take time to name and reflect it. Reflect on the things that you encounter. And let's move forward one slide, and then we'll flip back to this slide in a minute. So this is from an interview I conducted with a sommelier who happened to be involved in one of these tasting efforts. And he said to me that a lot of tasting water is assessing it on the palate. And by palate, he means not the painting palate, but actually in your mouth, so in your tongue, but also he's really referring to your tongue and then the experience that happens at the back of your mouth. If you ever want a fun game to play with kids, grab some Jelly Bellies, have them stick one in their mouth while their nose is plugged and ask them to tell you what it tastes like, and then have them unplug their nose and describe it, and they'll move from sweet to, oh, all this other stuff. It's really fun. So similarly, when we're tasting water or wine or cheese or chocolate, all of this is about that balance between what's happening on your tongue and what's happening in this orthonasal cavity back behind your mouth, going up into your nose. And this is why, if you have a cold, and I'm at like the very, very tail end of COVID, I'm over COVID, but I still have the leftovers, so I'm a little stuffed up. It gets harder to taste because actually we're not smelling. So Gilles said the balance of it, the acidity, etc., with a spirit, 90% of that experience is nosing it, so smelling it, and the palate is just kind of confirmation, that experience in the mouth, or information of what you've nosed previously. And then he says, in contrast, tasting water is the hardest thing I've ever done. It's brutal. So you're about to do something really hard, which is really awesome. Let's go back to the previous slide. So you have these two waters. I'm just going to go on ahead and suggest that you pick one of them at random. You're going to lift it up. I've got a cup of tisane here. If you covered it, you'll just open that cover a little bit and sniff it. See what you recognize, if anything, when you're smelling it. Think about it. Jot down some notes. Then you'll sip it, and then you'll name and reflect. And then if we could move forward to slide 7, or move forward 2 slides, yeah, right here. Here are some tasting notes for us to think with. So you might want to jot down flavors you encounter, textures. Is your water drying? Is it wetty? Like, does it make your mouth feel more wet or more dry than it was before? But additionally, what memories might you think of as you try this? And does anything else come out? So I'm going to be quiet for about another 2 to 3 minutes for you to just keep tasting and jotting down notes. And colleagues, I'd like you to feel free to both drop some comments into the chat with things you're noticing, maybe flavors, textures, memories, and also let me know where you are in your tasting. So what I'm starting to see is some of you have a few of you have definitely said, hey, I can taste my cup, which I always think is exciting because we don't often think about tasting our cups, but it turns out those do a lot of work in our sensory experience. And if you went on ahead and got those solo cups, they're probably doing a lot less of that additional information than perhaps if you're like me and you happen to be using a dishwasher soap that unfortunately leaves behind smelly residues. I wrote and complained to the Finnish folks about it, and they were not appreciative of my complaints, which was interesting. A few, actually, no one, nope, that's not true. One person so far has said their water tastes of nothing, which is really fun, because if you ask people this question, like what does your tap water taste like, just out of the blue, oftentimes they'll be like, they might say it's good, might say it's bad, they might say they never drink it, but they almost never can just tell you like this whole sort of description of it. Some of you are pointing out chlorine, and I loved this comment that, let's see if I can find it. Ashley said, faint chlorine reminds me of my childhood community pool. And then you mentioned, Ashley, that it's slightly unsettling, which is a really interesting sort of thing. Oh, wait, this connection with a childhood past, maybe that's not what I expect. Some of you have pointed out that there is some metallic aspect to your water, iron, for example, or some saltiness. One of you said wax. I'm guessing you're using a wax cup, but I don't know. That's really interesting. And this is just really fun. Now we have an additional slide. So if we could pop over to the bottled water slide. Previous one. Yep, fantastic. And a few of you, I love this. You're saying, I definitely know the difference between a water that I've tasted here at school or at home. Also, the pointing out of the use of a metal straw and how that influences the taste too. So go on ahead and add in what differences, if any, you noticed in your tap water between tap and bottled. So if we can move forward one for bottled. So what I'm seeing here with bottled is plastic. And, you know, if you do mention you taste plastic, go on ahead and put a note as to perhaps what kind of, I'm just curious. I find that different plastics, of course, leach into water differently. And so if you're purchasing a water like Dasani or Nestle Pure Life, which squishes really nicely, that one tends to have a lower quality plastic. And so your water's more likely to end up tasting plasticky. Or if you're a Costco shopper, you probably end up with a bunch of those really cheap ones. But a larger number of folks are saying they don't taste anything here than they did in their tap water. Except those of you who've been had your water around in that plastic bottle for a while. One of you is pointing out that there's a texture difference between your tap water and your bottled water. And there's also a difference in how drying or wetting it makes your mouth feel. One of you is using a filter and points out that the filtered water actually makes you want to continue drinking. It feels fresher and smoother. And these texture things are really important characteristics when it comes to water. Why do we think it might be a more important characteristic? So I'm just going to give a few more moments for these awesome comments to come in. I'm sorry you can't all see them, but I'll keep trying to narrate them for you. So one of you said that the tap water feels foggy in a way, dull, and the bottled water feels lighter, which is a really interesting question. Heaviness versus lightness might be related to minerality. And one of you notes that your water tastes like job site water, which is interesting. And someone asked about my favorite brand of water. I really like bubbly water that's super salty. So Gerald Steiner, if I'm going to be drinking a bottled water, it's super salty. And the water that I grew up with at home is, from my perspective, super phenomenal. It's really mineralized and fantastic. Interesting. One of you, Elise, has suggested that the bottled water Elise is tasting has a stronger metallic flavor than the tap water and a strong plastic flavor. And Elise bought this at the airport and just wondered if it was the least expensive kind they could sell with a high markup. And Frankie's asked what the best tap water I've ever had, and I think I'm gonna link back to another comment that one of your classmates put in, was that their water from New York tasted better to them than the water in Michigan. To me, my favorite water is, frankly, the water I grew up with, because it was a small town, it's a mountain spring, it's minimally treated, it has a fantastic flavor, and it's just delightful. But with all of that being said, I actually try to drink tap waters everywhere I go. And part of that is because even though when we imagine tap water as being uniform, you find out pretty quickly, as you all actually viscerally know, that when you go elsewhere, it's different. My in-laws live in Jacksonville, Florida, and quite frankly, their water is really hard to drink. Now, if I had a sulfur deficiency, it would probably be awesome, but there's a distinct sulfur note to the water. And it raises this interesting question of, what does the water tell us about where we are, and how might that information shape our experience? We here in the Phoenix area, our water comes either from the Colorado River or the Salt River and the Verde Rivers. And there's a reason that Salt River is named the Salt River. Our water is pretty salty here. And Frankie is backing me up on saying that Florida water is so sulfury. So yeah, thank you for that. Let's go on to the next slide. So I want us to think now, how did our water get to be the way that that there's this perception that it is the same everywhere? And I do want, by the way, I will come back at the end to talking about the safety question that many of you have raised in the comments, which is like, it doesn't taste good, is it safe? Or I'm not certain I trust my water, because I do think we need to come back to that. But first, let's think about how our water got this way. This is a postcard from the late 1800s, early 1900s of the South Chicago area, the Calumet Harbor and Sag Canal, I believe, and of the factories that are present in this area. And a lot of the reason that our water today tastes the way it does and is treated the way it is grows out of this early exuberance, industrial exuberance, if you will, that was happening all across the United States. And by United States, we're just going to kind of draw a line from the Mississippi River and head eastwards for this conversation. Next slide, please. Now, many of you perhaps in high school had to read a book by Upton Sinclair called The Jungle, which was all about Bubbly Creek and the massive amounts of animal waste from the Chicago slaughterhouses being dumped in the creek. And it happened to be, it's considered muckraker journalism. It was one of the first books that really helped push the US federal government to start changing the ways that it cared for food and water. But one of the additional things that was going on at the same time is railroads. So just as you're figuring out that, oh, dumping a bunch of stuff into the waterways is not a good idea, it's really polluting what's going on around us, it smells bad, we don't think it's safe. Pre-understanding microbiology, that idea of it smells bad also meant it really is unsafe. COVID brought us back into that miasmatic imagination where you walk through the world and someone coughs and you're immediately imagining yourself covered with glitter. But in this world, as there's this understanding that emerges in the late 1800s, 1870 onwards, about the dangers that microbes present to folks when they're found in water, you start getting the emergence of a regulatory system that says, hey, let's make certain there aren't microbes in the water. Ironically, it's most closely related to rail transit between different states. So the idea that you didn't want someone to get on a train in Chicago sick and tootle along over to Gary, Indiana, and somehow contaminate the water supply in Gary or tootle along over to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and make the water supply in Grand Rapids unsafe. And so you get this emergence of all this work of chlorinating water. If you want to read about it, there's a great book by one of the characters actually in my book, Michael McGuire, called The Chlorine Revolution, that talks all about the experimentation on humans that happened in the early 1900s, where a bunch of water workers were like, this stuff kills microbes. We are putting it in water, even though it's not necessarily legal at this point. And they produced one of the most massive public health revolutions in human history. It's perhaps saved more lives than anything else. And yet at the same time, if you do want to know about moments of experimentation that maybe shouldn't have happened, this is one of them. And so there's this specific moment in this world where water workers are putting chlorine into the municipal water to make it safe. But at the same time, we have these massive amounts of industrial contaminants being dumped into the waterways, specifically the surface waterways. And Lake Michigan provides us with a phenomenal example of one of those spaces where surface waterways that are also the dumping grounds for pollution. And in 1929, late December, early January, there's this episode in the city of Chicago where folks are turning on their taps, and the water coming out smells horridly medicinal. Like just so bad, you didn't even want to get anywhere near it. People wouldn't drink it. All of the bottled water, at least according to the Chicago Daily Tribune, all of the bottled water that was available on the south side of the city where this taste and odor episode happened sold out within hours. There were massive complaints to City Hall. Basically, it was the sort of nightmare that if you are a politician or in charge of a municipal utility, you never want to have. And what I have here is a map of the journey that the folks took to explore where those tastes and odors came from. And what they discovered was that there were steel plants down on that southwestern shore of Lake Michigan who'd been dumping phenol into the waters. And because of the way that the wind and the weather combined, it moved the phenol north up to the intake pipes that drew water into the city of Chicago. The phenol contaminated waters combined with the chlorine to create a horrible smelling molecule. And it's this episode that for me really marks what I'm going to call the first definition of industrial terroir, or the idea that the taste of place can be shaped by industrial activity. So if you haven't heard the term terroir before encountering my book introduction, just briefly, it is glossed by many scholars as being referring to the taste of place, or you could think of it as the taste of earth. I just want to briefly answer a question that was posed in the chat, which is, would there be iClicker questions? They were actually going to be the previous questions, and I did not communicate clearly with your instructors about the fact that the taste of your water would be the iClicker questions. So to my colleagues, my apologies. So this first definition of industrial terroir is really a taste of place shaped by human activity, shaped by industry. And for those of you who have perhaps grown up in a farming community, you might know that moment when you head out to the local canals and maybe they smell like onions. This was something that happened in the area my father grew up in, where when I was a kid, we used to swim in those canals. And by the time I became a teen, there was no way we were getting in the canals because you knew there was some weird chemical that had been put in there. Smelled like onions, looked super milky white. You didn't want that on your body. So can we move to the next slide? So in this area of, or this time period where the water is okay, or suddenly it isn't, there's all this experimentation going on. And specifically in the city of Chicago, they stole a water worker from Baltimore. His name was John Bayless, and dumped a bunch of money into supporting a program to help these folks here try and deal with unfortunate episodes of taste and smell. And I love this headline, makes the city's water taste like a spring. And this very supportive newspaper article goes through and says that these folks have produced a method of eliminating taste-producing compounds from Chicago's drinking water. And what it actually is they superchlorinate the water. They put lots and lots of chlorine in, and it certainly, in the way chlorine does, erases out most tastes and smells, unless there's something like phenol present that can interact with it and does actually leave behind some chlorine smells. But what interests me about this is that it is the start of what I see as an effort to essentially erase place or the presence of place from water. You know, it used to be you would go down to St. Louis and you'd turn on the tap and the water coming out would be slightly red colored. And you would expect to let your water sit and have the sediment drop out before you would drink it. Or if you went to New England, especially in the fall, you would turn on a tap and the water coming out would be tea colored, and it would probably have an unctuousness to it related to all of the organic compounds that were found in the water. And I would bet now that if you went to St. Louis or if you went to Bedford, New Hampshire, while the water might taste different, overall it'd be really quite similar. And so this is when the process of erasing place starts to really be put into place. Next slide, please. So I also think with an additional definition of industrial terroir, this is an absence of taste of place created by the work of engineers, chemists, psychophysicists. Psychophysicists are the folks who are like, hey, let's figure out how to measure how much you smelled or tasted in any specific thing. And any others tasked with managing perceptible cues in an industrial foodstuff. And I have here an image of the Chicago's test filtration plant. So if the last thing we talked about was in 1929, this is 1941. In those 10 plus years, the city had built a test filtration plant on the south side of Chicago where you could, if you were willing to hop in a car or walk, you could drive down and get their test water every single day, where it would just be available for you. And a lot of people did because it was better tasting water than what they could get out of their taps. And you can see here this idea that on the, at least on my screen, on the right side, you see raw water coming in. There's an intake valve. It goes through all of these different processes. And then there's an outtake valve that goes out to the pumping stations. And this to me is the place or the space where industrial terroir, that second meaning, really comes into being. So if in winemaking, terroir is not only the taste of a place, but as many scholars have argued, is also reflective of the labor and care and practices that go into it, then industrial terroir is similarly about the taste of place, but shows up in an absence of taste, made possible by the labor and care of engineers, chemists, and all the other supporting staff and folks who help bring that into being. And I think it's really interesting with municipal water because this is the one industrial product that's technically a food that actually gets piped into your home in the United States. And I should put a caveat there, not all of the United States. They're actually, off the top of my head, it's somewhere between 6 and 9% of the population. I probably have that number wrong, who do not have access to this sort of a water supply. My grandparents, for example, well-fed water is how, that's what we grew up drinking. And so for folks who live in a more rural situation, or for example, in the Phoenix area, in an unincorporated township, they may be still drawing on groundwater or well water, in which case this conversation is not relevant. And if you have friends who have, well, it's relevant, but it's a different form of relevancy. If you have friends who have a well, it's definitely worth going and trying their water and talking with them about that experience. Christine poses a question in here, why the discussions primarily relate to Chicago, and can I explain the significance of why Chicago? So the reason I focus on Chicago here specifically has to do actually with surface water as opposed to groundwater. So when you think about it this way, Surface water is pretty easy to contaminate. You dump stuff in, like if you happen to be a massive number of industrial still production plants that are all situated around Lake Michigan at the close of the 19th and opening to middle years of the 20th century. It's a really great place to dump your pollution or your discards, specifically because it dilutes it. And one of the core ideas that characterize much of the 20th century thinking about pollution is that dilution is the solution to pollution. And that nice little phrase shaped a lot of the early environmental approach to how regulators and others in the US dealt with polluting activities. And so Chicago, because of its situation on the shores of Lake Michigan, because of the ways that the weather moves the water around in the lake, had these really interim experiences. Now, Milwaukee upstream, up lake also did, but that specific location of Chicago and its proximity to all of the industrial activity that was happening around the bottom of Lake Michigan really shaped the taste and smell episodes, and then the city itself chose to invest in it. This isn't to say that there weren't folks all over in different cities doing research on taste and smell, because there were, and they were in conversation with each other. But figuring out how that work of managing taste and smell would happen, a lot of that did happen in this research space in the city of Chicago. Let's move on to the next slide, measuring industrial terroir. So if you have come up with a new treatment technique in, say, Grand Rapids, Michigan, or you have come up with a new treatment technique in Baltimore, or in St. Louis, or in Springfield, Illinois, and you want to talk with your other fellow water workers about it, you need to actually figure out a way to communicate about what you've done and to measure it. Now, you all just tasted some water, and you all tried to come up with descriptors for that water. I obviously provided you with some basic descriptors, but how did that go? Was it easy? Was it challenging? So Afan says very challenging, Victoria says hard, Sarah says hard, Kayla says challenging, Maya says hard, I see blurry, challenging, 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 hard, challenging, extremely challenging, hard and subjective, challenging. Taryn offers one nice alternative, easy. I can't tell a difference between well water and treated water. But this idea of how do you tell a difference, and then how do you measure it, and then how do you quantify it, so you can tell and actually prove to your colleagues that that it's worthwhile to spend a lot of money and install an activated carbon filtration step in your treatment train, or to buy a bunch of other things and install something. This is what was shaping that, I'm going to call it gustatory landscape in the early to middle 20th century when it came to the work of water workers. So they'd get together at meetings, and someone would stand up and present, hey, here's this new technique I have. It's really great. And perhaps that work had been funded by an engineering firm or a company that made activated charcoal, or some other version of that. And then someone in another municipality had to decide whether that system would actually work, whether they trusted that. And think about it. When it comes to home cooking, it's not a big deal really to swap in and out different ingredients. But when it comes to an infrastructure, it's a lot of money. And I don't know how many of you have recent ballot initiatives in your cities that you've been paying attention to that are probably asking you to sign up for a bond. So the city's going to sell bonds. Your taxes are going to go up to pay for those bonds. Those bonds are going to allow the city to upgrade its infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, it's a pretty big fiscal ask for a group of people to say, trust this technique, unless you can actually, if you can't demonstrate that it works. And so what emerges in it really starts in the 1920s, but really gets codified in the 1940s are these efforts to measure industrial terroir. And I do want to note, this is my term. The water folks never use this term. That's okay. They're not food studies scholars, they're lost. So the first attempt to measure industrial terroir came out of some work on olfactometry, which was specifically from the Netherlands. There's a scholar there named Zwaardemaker who was really interested in, could you measure smell? And his work got picked up by a young scholar, Eleanor Procter Gamble. I hope I got her name entirely right. And she did a bunch of work on it, and she was like, huh, this is hard, but you can measure it. And then that work gets further picked up eventually by the water workers. And they introduced this concept of the threshold odor number. And when I'm thinking about a threshold, I'm thinking about that space where you go from being able to perceive something to where you can't perceive something, or similarly can't perceive to perceive. So think about it. You're wearing a backpack. It has a bunch of books in it. If I put a letter in it, are you going to notice the difference? Most likely not. So that would be below the noticeable difference threshold. In contrast, if you are wearing a backpack with nothing in it and I put one book in it, you are going to notice the difference. And so this concept of the point at which people notice the difference starts to frame the creation of these numbers that water workers would apply to something. And so in 1899, there was a scale introduced where one was very faint. It was undetectable by the average consumer. So the idea that an expert could detect it, but a consumer couldn't, was intrinsic to this. As I pointed out earlier, I think we're all everyday experts. And so I'm not certain that this is actually something that in practice always applied, but that was how the scientists at the time were thinking about it. And then they rated all the way up to a 5, where at the time an odor was so intense that no one would willingly choose it unless it was kind of the last thing available. And these practices, so there's all sorts of conversation amongst these water workers as to like, how do you do this? How do we measure it? And they start using this practice from mid-1930s, really early 1940s, up through about the 1970s to talk about the treatment processes they come up with and to compare the efficacy between different treatment processes. And this is, you know, it's what science does. Science tries to figure out ways to measure things so we can then compare amongst different samples. It makes a lot of sense to do this. Next slide, please. The problem, as McGuire mentions, and this is the guy again who wrote The Chlorine Revolution, is that the threshold odor number doesn't tell you anything about what's causing the odor. And as he points out, we know it's chemicals, but it doesn't give you any idea how to treat the thing. So it gives you a number. It can say we reduced it, but if you have a taste and odor problem show up, it doesn't do anything other than say the number's present. And McGuire was at the time working for the Metropolitan Water District, which is in the Los Angeles region. Water districts are set up in different ways. So for example, in my town, we get our water from a well, as I said, and then it's treated by the guy who also plows the streets at home. And you know, he just dumps chlorine in and that's it. In contrast, here in Phoenix, we have a whole series of municipal water suppliers working together. Some of the water is managed by a group called EPCOR. They're a publicly traded company. They do the water for a bunch of folks. And then I'm in the city of Phoenix. The city of Phoenix manages its water. In contrast, in Southern California, the Metropolitan Water District is like an umbrella agency that then sells water. So it treats water and then turns around and sells it to different municipalities around the region. And they draw their water from, amongst many other things, a lake called Lake Matthews. And McGuire told me that they'd had this experience where they started getting these taste and odor complaints in. And the water that they were getting into the system, like it came in, it smelled fine, they treated it, it went out, it smelled fine to them. And then folks at the very, very end of the distribution line would be calling and complaining and saying, hey, this is a problem. And they actually describe it as one of the worst taste and odor episodes that they had experienced at that point in the previous 40 years. I recently got an email from someone who read my book and worked there at that time period, and he said, I don't remember it, but I do remember an episode with frogs. So there you go, smelly frogs. But and what McGuire recounts is that they actually took a bunch of divers up to Lake Matthews, and they knew they were looking for some sort of algae, and they went out, and he says, you know, I'll never forget the day. This diver comes up, he holds up a hand full of green goo, and this is why I have this picture from the Alliance for the Great Lakes, not related at all to the episode I'm talking about. He held it up and we sniffed it, and I knew that was the thing. And so at this point, water workers have some really great new technologies that have emerged that allow them to identify the molecules that are present in samples and to even characterize them. But there's still this question of like, okay, the machine's telling us there are a bunch of things in here that might potentially be smelly, but which ones matter? And so they needed a new approach that wasn't the threshold odor number for thinking about and measuring industrial terroir. Next slide. So what they ended up doing was drawing on an approach that had been developed for the food industry called flavor profile analysis. This was introduced in 1949. It was one of the first approaches to actually quantifying sensory experiences of taste and smell. And you see here this lovely image that doesn't mean anything to you, or really to many of us at this point. Specifically, this idea of flavor is a multifaceted experience. How do we think about the intensities between different things? How do we describe? How do we even train our bodies to learn to describe together? And in the 1970s, late 1960s, early 1970s, the consultants at this company who developed it, Arthur D. Little, started reaching out to folks in the environmental industry. So they moved from the food industry into the environmental industry and started saying, hey, you know, we would love to share this technique with you. We think it'll be really powerful for engaging with and thinking about the problems of taste and smell that you're encountering. And, you know, one of the fun things that happens is people talk to people. And so at Drexel University, you had a coffee scientist on one side of a hall, an environmental scientist on the other side of the hall, and they became friends and they talked about stuff. And so the environmental scientist had learned about flavor profile analysis from the coffee scientist, and that's how they ended up all sharing this thing. And so what happens is you end up with these groups of people all around the United States who are being trained in this flavor profile analysis approach for thinking about how to measure industrial terroir. Ironically, this is almost never used in the food industry anymore, but it is still the process that's being used in the water industry to make sense of tastes and smells that are found in the water supply. And the reason they wanted to do this is because of the assumption that if you train a body to taste in certain ways or to smell in certain ways, and you train them together so they develop a shared language, like we could do if we could all sit down together in a room and we could spend days tasting, let's say, the most amazing chocolates from the different single origin chocolates from all around the world. And as we're tasting these things, we're going to develop a shared language. So when I say musty and you say corky, we actually know we mean the same thing, and we develop a word, musty corky, to stand in for them. And then we also perhaps start identifying what's the specific chemical compound that leads to that. And this leads to a way of thinking about, understanding, and characterizing water for water workers that's extremely different from how you and I think about it. Next slide, please. And that would be these forms of talking about water, organizing tastes and odors with relationship to specific chemical components or molecular identities that you and I just don't have. Now, I know this slide is super small. The image is also in my book. It's almost impossible to read, which is unfortunate, but there it is. This is one of the tools that was developed in the late 1980s for folks to think about and talk about and communicate about the problems that they were finding in their water supply. And so you could think of this as a picture of the potential flavor profile, the tastes and odors found in your water before it ever gets to you. And I don't know about you, but if I were to sit down and a water sommelier were to walk up to me and invite me to try something with earthy, musty, moldy, chlorinous, grassy, marshy flavors, I might decline. And I'm so intrigued by that idea that I might decline, that potentially has come to shape the entire conversation about what water should taste like. Next slide. Because I'm actually really excited about the fact that the water I taste smells and tastes like, or could smell and taste a little bit like the place I live. Because, you know, a lot of people pay a lot of money for wines that taste like a place. We pay a lot of money potentially for single origin coffee or chocolate that tastes like a place. I just came back from Hawaii a few months ago, and we had gone to visit a small high-end cacao farm. And one of the things they said was, you know, our cocoa beans actually taste different. The chocolate made from our cocoa beans, even though they're the same trees, it tastes different between summer and winter. Like, how lovely and amazing to get to taste time and to get to taste a place. And that's a lot of what was at the heart of marketing of bottled water in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And those of you who were around during that time period might remember going from a childhood where there were drinking fountains everywhere to a teenagedom or young adulthood where there were water bottles everywhere. And we've now moved into a new phase, which I would call the Stanley Cup phase. Stanley Cups everywhere. Who knows where the water in them is coming from? And municipal water providers in the early or the late aughts, like 2008, 2009, 2010, some a little bit earlier, started pushing back against this marketing that was coming out from the bottled water producers. And a lot of that marketing from the bottled water producers was essentially, our water tastes great. Our water's amazing. This is how water should taste. And cities like the city of Paris start conducting tastings in the streets, where initially they have folks like you and me coming to do the everyday work of tasting, following kind of the sensory science approach, where I might be given, and the very first year they did this, they actually put the city of Paris's tap water up head to head with Evian, and asked people, you know, which one they thought was better, which one they liked better. The following year, they stopped doing that, and this is when I got to volunteer with them, and you can see me here happily holding carafes, filling up from a water fountain in Paris. If you're ever there, these lovely fountains have very lovely potable water for you to drink. They're not just decorations. And this is the funny thing, you go to Paris, there are water fountains everywhere. They just don't look like what we're used to. This process of grabbing or sharing out the water resulted in a bunch of people saying things like, wait, this isn't the water I have at home. My water doesn't taste this good, even though it was the same water. Which leads us to the final challenge that municipal water providers have. You and I each all have our own system. So they're responsible for managing that water line up until it reaches the walls of your home. But the second that it reaches the walls of your home, you are now responsible for those pipes. And so the tastes of the water that come into your home might be entirely different from the tastes of the water that they send out from that plant. And there's this challenge that emerges for all of us to become folks who care for water, who are capable of shepherding the tastes of our water in our home. And maybe, like some of you said, you might run it through a Brita filter because maybe you just don't like the way your water tastes, and that helps. Maybe you're concerned about safety, so you're running it through a pure filter. No, Brita doesn't do a good job with stripping potentially unsafe things out like lead. It does do a good job of potentially removing taste and smell. As my husband points out, he thinks it makes the water taste boring. Or maybe you're going to just let your water sit for a half hour uncovered, maybe to allow the chlorine to escape because you don't like the taste of water. Or you're going to refrigerate it because no matter what, if you're tasting your water cold, it's going to taste a lot better than room temperature if it's very flavorful. And so this has led to an era that we're currently in, which I'm going to call the era of thinking about and marketing tap water as something that is as good or not, if not as good, even better than bottled water. And for that, I'd like us to go to the next slide, and we're going to briefly watch the Chicago video that I mentioned. Oh, never mind. I wanted to do this, and then I'll do that. My slides here, I didn't update the way I updated your slides. So here's an example of one of the tastings that happened in the city of Paris. Those of you who speak French would recognize that this large water tanker has the phrase "open et grand cru" on it. You can see a tap that has a corkscrew at the top. And so at the time, the city of Paris was using this concept of a Grand Cru, which is like the finest, most expensive of wines, to compare with their water, to say essentially, hey, our water is like a fine, expensive wine. It's been cared for. We put a lot of work into making it what it is. As a hilarious side note, the Wine Growers Association of France sued the city of Paris for this, and so they are no longer allowed to use this marketing campaign. But that aside, I love this marketing campaign. So we'll close out with the Chicago video. Next slide. And then we'll move to questions.
I don't have a play button. Does this?
Maybe we won't.
I don't know if it successfully embedded the video. I'm so sorry. I don't yeah, it just doesn't seem to.
Yeah, let's just assume it didn't. I will stick a link in for all of you guys so you can copy and paste it and watch it at your will. And let's go on ahead. And I just wanted to just say thank you for this opportunity. If you want to find me, I'm easily findable via email. I have a website where I talk about some of the work that I've been doing in the sensory laboratory, which, by the way, finally has a physical home as of a few weeks ago. I'm occasionally on X. I'm occasionally on Instagram. I use Instagram for personal reasons, but if you want to follow pictures of feet, trees, and other things that are generally not people's faces, please hang out with me there. My press editor would undoubtedly love for me to tell you to order the book online. You can use the code UCPSAVE30 to get 30% off, but sneaky hint, if you follow the University of California Press on Instagram, they quite often post codes that are more like 40% off, which makes it much cheaper than Amazon. But yeah, let's go on ahead and turn to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for accompanying us through that water tasting. The moment you mentioned that maybe the water might make my tongue feel dry, that was a whole moment for me. I needed to take a second because it did make my mouth feel dry. Very, very exciting. Thank you for that. I need to sit with my water a little more often.
Yeah, isn't it amazing? Because we don't ever think about water as being drying per se.
No, and it's just, yeah, right. They're supposed to be opposites. Anyway, I gotta think about some more. I'm gonna get to our questions. We have a few in the Q&A. This one comes from Elliot, and they ask, what are the health effects of chlorine-treated water as compared to mineral water or well water? Does it strip essential minerals from the body, as I've seen popularly believed on social media? What are the health effects of water contaminants that make fountains/terminals in the same building taste and feel different? And how are these regulated?
Elliot, thank you so much for this fantastic series of questions. I'm going to start with an interesting set of research that's been emerging primarily from India, where folks who are very well-to-do have been installing really high-level reverse osmosis systems in their home. And they're finding that people who drink heavily filtered water, so the water that might taste the way you imagine it should taste, that might taste like bottled water, are getting osteoporosis at a much younger age than they should be. Because it turns out that our water is an amazing supply of minerals. And what I say next is not at all something I've pursued scientifically or to see if anyone's talked about. I have this theory, according to Christy, which is that part of the reason the water in the area I live in is so salty is because my body needs salty water. So that's the theory according to Christy. So I think there's potentially an interesting relationship between taste and the minerals found in, or excuse me, place and the minerals found in the waters in the place that could be very health promoting. That being said, if the minerals found in your water are radioactive, perhaps that's not so health promoting. So chlorine treated water, in general, especially if you let that chlorine evaporate off, has the best health effect ever, which is it is safe water to drink, and you're not going to get cholera from it. So it's very safe. It doesn't mess with minerals per se or strip essential minerals from the body. That being said, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that there are not ways in which chlorine can combine with other molecules to create stuff that is not safe. And the EPA regulates that. And one of the best things you could do is go take a look. Your municipal water is tested more often than bottled water is ever tested, and your municipality is required to post information about the safety of your water. And so you can just take a look and see, are they doing their job?
Great. Thank you for those answers. I'm very shocked to hear about the reverse osmosis causing those health issues. So thank you for that. On to our next question. Why does the bottled water in Europe taste different than the one here in the US? And this is from Alexa.
Okay, Alexa, this is one of my favorite questions. So the bottled waters in Europe also have what you could call a comparison to a nutrition label here, which is going to be a list of the minerals and their levels of minerals in the water. As I pointed out in my note to you guys, when I invited you to find a water with a high level of total dissolved solids, it can be really fine to do in the United States. In contrast, Europe has a very strong, robust history of using waters, mineral waters, as medicine. And it's actually only a 20th century thing where they show up on the table. So that water I mentioned, the Gerolsteiner, that I really like, historically would have been used for someone if they had an upset stomach. So what you're actually encountering is these different flavor profiles are valued, and they're even associated with different health impacts. So when I lived in France, Epar, which has a really high level of magnesium and tastes disgusting, but feels really silky in your mouth, was heavily marketed to women because it could help you poop more and thus potentially help you lose weight. Or Vitel, which is my husband's favorite water, it's actually a little unctuous. That one's often marketed to athletes for the fact that it has a pretty good level of salts that, here we have Gatorade marketed to us, there it's water.
Interesting, those two differences. Our third question is, do sources of well water that are not treated by filtration plants require filtration? How does this filtration occur? Adler shares with us that they were born in northern Michigan, and well water tends to have a strong iron taste, likely due to natural contamination. But I was told this water was always safe. Is there a filtration process that occurs within the wells that help remove harmful contaminants?
So this is where if you own a well, you want to get it tested regularly because it may require filtration and it may not. Many of the folks I know who draw on well water, they do have much higher levels of minerals present than the EPA might allow. So when you go read about individual well water systems and this conversation that there are many folks, this percentage of folks in the United States don't have access to safe water. Sometimes that unsafe water is being defined because it has higher levels of minerals in it. So more iron perhaps, or more sulfur or something, than what the EPA has deemed according to a regulatory structure to be the acceptable standard. So it may be that the folks who are living somewhere with well water that is high in iron, they have the dual challenge of their appliances having stuff build up on them, their whites becoming slightly pink, but perhaps they are ever iron deficient. So it's just an interesting tension that you have to work with. And I do want to point out that your local land grant university in your state probably has resources to help you figure that out, because those extension agencies are amazing.
Our fourth question is from Isabella. Do you know if there is a specific reason why so many cities have multiple water sources? For example, my hometown comes from several different streams, the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, and Lake Huron. Is this cost-effective, municipal restrictions, or safety? Thinking through your talk on industrial terroir manifesting itself as a lack of taste / erasure of taste in water, I would imagine that using one water source and filtering and treating that source would be easier than using multiple sources.
This is a great question. It would most likely be easier, although individual water sources vary with seasonality. So here in Phoenix, our water gets real tasty, or rephrase, it gets green and musty in October, November because of what's going on upstream, like the natural, when it finally starts cooling down, the microbial life in our water gets really happy, and you get to taste the end result of the fact that they're having a party. Obviously, treatment removes it to some extent, but the main component, geosmin, people are really, 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 really good at sensing at super small levels. So one of the reasons a city might use multiple different sources is going to have to do with redundancy. So if one of those sources gets contaminated, a city wants to be able to shut that off and draw from a different source. Because the worst thing that you can have happen is actually for your entire system to be depressurized, because then all that pressure running through pipes actually helps keep the pipes safe. So you have water potentially going out, but nothing coming in. You depressurize your municipal water system, and every single line is now potentially contaminated. So that's actually a huge problem. So they want to avoid that. The water demand varies. So imagine Super Bowl Sunday during halftime, how many toilets are all flushing in that like 30 to 45-minute period versus before and after? So there's this massive draw. And the final thing is, and this is something from the 70s onwards, is we're doing a better job trying to protect our waterways. So if you're only drawing from one place, you might draw too much water out and negatively impact the marine life there.
Okay. Our fifth question is, what do you think about the rise of canned water, such as liquid death?
Okay. I might not be able to pull the Chicago ad link in time for when we end without making you all listen to it. But part of me is like in love with it when it's something like a marketing campaign from the city of Chicago to say to you, hey, pause, you should actually really value this thing that we've spent all this time making for you. Liquid death is just fascinating, though. I mean, as someone who doesn't drink alcohol, I have to agree with the idea that it's really nice to go somewhere with a beverage that is aimed at you. As someone who thinks it is absolutely crazy from an environmental and sustainability point to be putting water, which is super heavy, in cans and then circulating it around the nation in different ways or across the globe, excuse me, it's strange. But you know, fashion is a strange thing. But hey, if it speaks to your needs and it is going to make certain you get home safely and you get your other folks home safely, by all means, drink up.
Agreed. Next one, how does the mineral content of water affect its taste?
Lucy, this is such a fantastic question. So I didn't talk about this here, but in the final full chapter of my book, I actually look at an effort to do water recycling that's happening here in Arizona and elsewhere. And when you recycle water, you're essentially taking wastewater, as gross as it can be, and you are stripping everything out of it. And if you literally strip everything out of it, it makes really great water for brewing beer with, because then they can build back in the mineral content exactly as they'd like it to be. But if you were to drink it, one, it wouldn't taste good. Two, if you drank too much of it, it would be really bad for your body. And three, it wouldn't taste good. Because it turns out that the thing that makes water so pleasant in many ways is its minerality. But that minerality can shift from point to point. So for example, you may have something that has a lot of calcium in it, and that's not going to actually taste good, versus if it's a smaller level of calcium, a higher level of sodium, and some sort of balancing out. Depending on what you're used to, you might find it really pleasurable. And so I'll finish with one last thing. A few years ago, my colleague Marisa Mannheim And I built an exhibit where we created a water bar. We had different waters, one from the west side of the valley. It was a groundwater, one from the east side of the valley, and one that had been run through a reverse osmosis process. So it was as close as you could get to that recycled water. And most folks who were trying that west side of the valley water was pretty salty. Had really strong reactions. I had a woman swear at us for even introducing those flavors to her mouth. I thought it was fine. I like my water salty. And 2 French men wandered through our exhibit and they're like, this is great. This is exactly what we love. So I think for my closing thing, I just want to highlight that in some ways there is no accounting for taste, but we can also retrain our tastes. And you can, if you wish to, become an expert in what these tastes and smells teach you about your water, where it came from. And alongside that, potentially find it a lot easier to start making choices with regards to supporting a municipal infrastructure that really makes water equitably available. And with that, I do have to add that asterisk that this is also a great reason to get really involved with your city council to find out how they are managing your local municipal water supplier and to make certain that appropriate funding is going into that infrastructure so it can continue to provide safe water for everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you for those closing statements. I really appreciate that. I believe I'm going to turn the time over to Margot for the last bit of this.
I have just a few concluding things. One, before everybody leaves, I wanted to quick do an iClicker poll, in part just to see if it's working because we struggled so much last week. So this is mostly a test. This is not really we're doing the grade based on attendance this week, so you've already gotten credit for the attendance part. But if you're still here, what I'd like to know, and let me start it. Let's see. I'll explain just aloud though what we're gonna do. Would you be excited to taste more place in your water? And you're going to answer A, if yes, you would love to taste more place in water. B, if no, thanks very much, the place tastes bad. Or 3, maybe it depends. I don't really know. Could be interesting, could be scary. So let me start the poll. Multiple choice. Let's see, is that... I'm going to try and do this here. So hopefully, and the screen doesn't matter. We're going to select this, but the answers are not on the screen. So again, you're seeing this screen. It's giving us 40 seconds roughly. So A was, yes, I want to taste more place in my water. B is no, no, thank you. No more place in my water. And C is maybe. And we'll wait 20 more seconds. I wonder if you're still here, Christy. We had a question. Do filters like Brita remove beneficial minerals? Do we have time to scoot that one in?
Filters like Brita do not necessarily remove a bunch of beneficial minerals. They primarily are pulling out organic compounds. So those would be the smelly, tasty things. And minerals aren't going to stick to activated carbon, but it really depends on what's in your filtration system.
Awesome. Can I display these? I ought to be able to. All right. I'm not sure I can do it, but I'll just tell you. The results were 43 or 29% answered A, 32 or 21% answered B, and most people, 74, 49% C. Maybe is the answer to that question tonight. Okay, just briefly what we expect next week. And actually, I just got word that Hannah Whitlock from Starbucks Workers United is going to join us as well. Some of you may have heard about her story. She worked at the Starbucks on Main Street here in Ann Arbor and was fired for organizing a union there, and then successfully sued to get her job back. Now that Starbucks appears to have closed, so she's not there, but we'll hear from her more about what she is doing now. Also on the panel is Laura McIntyre of Rock United. If you saw or are familiar with Saru Jayaraman's work, that's the organization that she's been working with to try and improve working conditions for restaurant workers. We'll also have Laura Nadal from Justice for Migrant Women and Celise Christie of Heal Food Alliance in Chicago. So it's going to be a great panel talking about the gains and struggles of organizing workers in the food system. And I think that's it. We will see you guys next week.